All right, so we're diving into some pretty fascinating stuff today. We've got this tension brewing between Elon Musk, Starlink specifically, and well, the UK government.
Yeah, feels like a bit of a showdown, doesn't it? Like old school ways of doing things versus this whole new frontier.
Exactly. On one side, you've got this drive for like pushing the limits of tech, connecting everyone everywhere, and then on the other, you've got the UK trying to, I guess, keep things in check, right?
Mhm.
Fair competition, national interest, all that.
And the sources we've got here, they really get into the nitty-gritty of this whole thing. It's complex.
It is. So for our listeners, think of this deep dive as like a cheat sheet. We're going to break down the big clashes, what each side is saying, and how this could ripple out, not just in the UK, but globally.
We're talking potential aha moments here without getting too bogged down in the weeds.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. Starlink, for anyone who's been living under a rock, is Musk's plan to beam internet down from space. A whole network of satellites zipping around the Earth, super high speed, reaching places that, traditional internet just can't.
And that's where things get interesting, right? Because the UK government, through Ofcom, their regulator, is starting to get a little, well, nervous.
Yeah, nervous is putting it mildly. They're seeing red flags, especially when it comes to Starlink potentially becoming this, like, unstoppable force in the internet world, squeezing out all the competition.
Right, that whole market dominance thing. And it's not just some abstract worry. One of the sources quotes this Dr. Emily Carter. She's a tech policy expert at Oxford. And she uses this analogy. It's pretty stark. She says the UK is worried Musk could end up with disproportionate power over communication.
Akin to, get this, a digital East India company.
Yeah, that's the one. It really throws you back, doesn't it? I mean, think about the power the original East India Company had.
Yeah,
Economic, political, the whole shebang.
it's a pretty loaded comparison. So what are your thoughts? Like, is this a valid fear? This idea of Starlink becoming this digital behemoth that, basically calls the shots.
Well, it's definitely worth considering. I mean, if Starlink does become the main way people in the UK get online, then yeah, Musk would have a lot of leverage. We're talking about controlling the flow of information, setting the terms of service, potentially even prioritizing certain types of data over others. It's a big deal. And the UK government naturally wants to make sure they can still protect consumers, ensure a level playing field, all that jazz.
Right. So it's not just about like, oh, Musk is getting too big. It's about the UK potentially losing control over a vital piece of its infrastructure.
Exactly. And then you throw in the whole free speech thing, and it gets even more tangled. The UK has this online safety bill. It's all about trying to, I guess, clean up the internet,
Mhm.
get rid of harmful content. But then you've got Musk, who's this self-proclaimed free speech absolutist.
Yeah, he's been pretty vocal about that, especially with his whole takeover of, well, what used to be Twitter. Now it's DigX.
Yeah, yeah. It's kind of ironic. You've got the UK trying to impose these rules on online platforms, and then you've got Starlink, potentially this massive platform whose owner basically says, nah, not playing by those rules.
So how do you even begin to square that circle? Like, how do you balance the need to protect people, especially online, with the ideal of free and open communication?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And this is where it gets really tricky for the UK. One of the sources points out this dilemma. Do they crack down on Starlink, try to like really rein it in?
Which could stifle innovation, right?
Yeah, especially if it means people in remote areas, like, say, the Scottish Highlands, end up waiting even longer for decent internet. But then if they go too easy on Starlink, well, we're back to that whole market dominance problem and potentially a free-for-all in terms of content.
So it's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Pretty much. And the sources do a good job of, like, laying out the two main arguments here. You've got what they call the Musk doctrine, which is basically all about like less regulation, more freedom for companies to innovate.
Move fast and break things, that whole Silicon Valley ethos.
Exactly. And in the case of Starlink, the argument is that, look, we're bringing internet to places that have been completely ignored by the traditional providers. If you tie us down with red tape, people are going to lose out.
Okay, so that's Musk's side. But what about the UK? What's their counterargument?
Well, their hypothetical official basically says, hold on a minute. We need rules. Rules are what ensure a level playing field. They protect people. And they bring up a really interesting point. Should one person or one company have that much control over something as essential as the internet?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And the source doesn't shy away from connecting this to what's happening on X, too. And with all the concerns about misinformation and extremist content, it's like, if Musk is willing to let things slide on one platform, what's to stop him from doing the same with Starlink?
Right. It's about accountability. Who's ultimately responsible for what happens on Starlink? Can the UK government really enforce its laws if Musk decides he doesn't want to play ball?
So we've got market dominance, we've got censorship, and then there's this whole security angle too.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one. The sources mention the potential for, like, foreign governments using Starlink for espionage. I mean, think about it. These are satellites beaming data all over the world. Who's to say that data can't be intercepted or even manipulated?
So out of all of this, what do you think is the most, I don't know, the most worrying aspect, or maybe the most interesting from a purely analytical standpoint?
I think it's hard to pick just one. They're all intertwined, right? But honestly, that whole clash between censorship and national law, that's what really gets me thinking. Like, imagine the UK passes a law that says, okay, this type of content is banned, and then Musk said, nope, my platform, my rules. What happens then? It's almost like a constitutional crisis in the digital world.
Yeah, it's like who has the final say? And that's kind of what the source is getting at with this whole, democracy versus disruption thing.
Right. It's this tension between the established ways of doing things with governments and laws and all that, and these disruptive technologies that are basically rewriting the rule book. And it's playing out everywhere, not just in the UK.
Yeah, the source mentions the EU and India too. The EU has its Digital Markets Act, which is all about reining in big tech, and India has its own data localization rules. So it's like everyone's trying to figure out how to deal with this new reality.
And the thing is, because Starlink is so global by nature, what happens in the UK could have a domino effect. If Musk wins this one, if he manages to, like, sidestep the regulations, then other countries might think twice about pushing back.
But on the flip side, if the UK manages to hold firm, to set some clear boundaries, then that could embolden other countries to do the same.
Exactly. So the stakes are pretty high. And then, of course, there's that whole dual use aspect to consider, too. The source quotes a cybersecurity analyst who says, look, satellite internet can be amazing. It can connect people, bridge the digital divide.
But it can also be used for, well, less noble purposes, surveillance, espionage, that sort of thing.
Exactly. And that just adds another layer of complexity to the whole regulatory dilemma. Because how do you prevent the bad without stifling the good? How do you harness the potential of this technology without opening the door to all sorts of unintended consequences?
So, big questions, no easy answers.
Mm.
That seems to be the theme of today's deep dive. But as we wrap up, I think it's important to reiterate just how significant this clash between Musk and the UK really is. It's not just about satellites or internet speeds. It's about power, control, and ultimately, who gets to shape the future of the digital world. We've seen how this tension is playing out in terms of market dominance, content moderation, national security, and even the fundamental tension between democracy and disruption.
And I think what's really crucial for our listeners to take away from this is that this isn't just some abstract policy debate. It has real-world implications for all of us. The decisions being made today will shape the digital landscape we all inhabit tomorrow.
So as you go about your day, as you scroll through your feeds, as you connect with friends and family online, keep this in mind. Every click, every interaction is part of this larger story. And the choices we make as individuals and as societies will ultimately determine the kind of digital future we create for ourselves and for generations to come.
Yeah, that's a good point to leave things on. It's on all of us to think critically about these issues, to engage in these conversations, and to make our voices heard. Because the future of the internet and, frankly, the future of our world is being shaped right now.
Could have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next week with another fascinating topic, so be sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Until then, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Absolutely. Catch you next time.
See ya.